Okay, welcome everybody. We don't want to be too Middle Eastern and start too late. That's a Middle Eastern way. So welcome everybody. I want to thank you all for being here. There's a hodgepodge of some wonderful individuals here. We have students from two of my classes, Poli-Sci 257, History 230, Introduction to the Middle East. I have students from my Poli-Sci 490, which is a course on Model Arab League, and we're all going to Washington to play the Arab League, so this is all going to teach them how to think about current events. Melissa Finn's class from Wilfrid Laurier is here, welcome. I see a lot of colleagues and friends who have come to join us, so thank you all for being here. We're very happy that you all could make it. Feel free to keep going in and out and get lots of food. We have Arabesque coming for lunch, which is a treat for those of you who haven't had Middle Eastern food before. This is hopefully going to pique your interest. And so welcome to all faculty and students for being here. And just quickly wanted to thank Balsillie School. You're all here at the BSIA, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, to give you just a little bit of background to what we are, because I do want to plug the school. I want to thank them for sponsoring this event, making sure you guys are all well fed, which is a Middle Eastern tradition, so this is something that I want to make sure everybody gets good food out of this. And also thank you because they've Chris back there, my favorite videographer. We've been to Australia together. Where else have we been, Chris? All over the world? Washington, everywhere. Yeah, Chris is our lead videographer at CIGI and the Center for International Governance Innovation, where I'm also a senior fellow. And this is all being videotaped, so everything is on the record, which is good to know. Also, this will be up on YouTube and on the BSIA website. And back to the BSIA quickly, this is an international affairs school. We teach graduate programs, both master's and PhD. For those at UW and WLU, I really hope that you guys think about joining our school. We offer a very exciting number of master's programs, both through Wilfrid Laurier and University of Waterloo. Feel free to talk to me about it if you're interested. We have brochures outside about the school and about our programs. And again, I think as you will see, this is a wonderful place to be, not just architecturally, it's won lots of awards, but also we bring together all of the, I think, leading Canadian intellectuals working on international affairs under one roof. So we're very proud of what we're able to offer you guys. So this is a bid for recruitment, and numbers are down, so I have to do my bit. So please do think about us, and if you have any questions about BSIA or would like to take a tour, feel free. This is your building, so please walk around and get to know some of the students and faculty. We're all very open, and if you want to come another day, please talk to me. I'll be happy to set something up for you as well. I'm Bessma Momani. I teach here at the University of Waterloo's Balsillie School and a senior fellow at CIGI. Some of you already know me because you're a professor, so you should know who I am. And if not, those of you, welcome. Thank you for all being here. And I'm really excited about our day. This is all about current affairs of the Middle East and current politics. I've told our panelists and those invited to not prepare notes because we really want this to be a conversation. We want this to be something that you would find in the great Arab tradition of a salon or a cafe, right? So that we just have a conversation about what's going on. We want it to be fluid. Please remember that. Again, we don't want this to be scripted. Just think about being yourselves, but you're on camera. So that's the only thing. Some of us who have conversations in the privacy of our own salon know that the current political climate in the Middle East isn't always conducive to having these kind of conversations, but you are being videotaped, so I keep that in mind. I have the honor of introducing our first panel. This is the Egypt panel, and I have, I think, some, three like-minded Egyptians, so this is a bit different because I'm going to play the devil's advocate today, which I don't like to, and I shouldn't even say it in those terms, but I'm going to be, I guess, exposing my bias here by saying the devil's advocate. But we have three great scholars here. I'll start with, to my very far left, Mohamed, a colleague, and also we are writing a book together. We just finished co-editing a book that has been accepted by Indiana University Press. Dalia is also a contributor to that, and Wael was a part of the panel or the book workshop that we had last year here. Eid is a visiting scholar at Guelph University. He is on his way to Qatar to join the Doha Institute. Has a doctorate and master's from George Washington University. He specialized in Middle Eastern studies, modern Arab literature, culture, and U.S. Middle East encounter in Arab American literature. Dalia is assistant professor of political science at Long Island University, Brooklyn. She received her BA from New York University in politics and Middle Eastern studies with a minor in peace and global policy studies. Dr. Fahmy then completed an MA from New York University International Relations. She has her PhD from Rutgers University in political science, and her research examines the intellectual and political development of modern Islamist movements. To my left, I have Dr. Wael Haddara, and Wael is a unique person because he's actually an associate professor in the Division of Endocrinology and Metabolism at the Department of Medicine, Western University, as well as associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Dundee. Now, why I really like having Wael here is because he once told me he really wished he didn't go into medicine and did a PhD in political science. You admit it?
Medicine and then political science.
Medicine and then political science, yes. So I just say avoid that whole medicine stuff and that whole med school and just come straight into a master's and PhD. So Dr. Wael plays political scientist more than, at least I know him on Twitter, so he wants to be a political scientist, I can tell you right now. His tweets on political science is much more interesting than his medical stuff.
Thank you. I will take that as a compliment. My colleagues will not.
Dr. Wael served also as an advisor to the former President Mohamed Morsi during his election campaign in 2012, that's in Egypt, and continued to serve as an advisor over the course of the presidency year in office. So he's had a political appointment, so he can tell you what it's like to be in that position. So welcome, everybody. Thank you again for agreeing to be here. So let's start. And I'm going to give a little bit of background because part of my goal in having my class here too, if you don't mind, is letting them know kind of where things are in current politics of the Middle East. So this is the professorial part of me here. You know, Egypt has been through a lot, right? I mean, we can all agree. I quib because we all have family who are related to, all three have family related, who live in Egypt. I'm married to an Egyptian. So I know what it's like to have these conversations. Frankly, they're heated, they're awful. Sometimes we no longer talk anymore because of how tense Egypt is. Egypt is divided on a lot of issues. To give a background to the class, we all know that the Arab Spring hit Egypt in a profound way. Millions poured into Tahrir Square in 2011 to overthrow then regime government of President Mubarak. He was overthrown. The military came in. Then the military allowed a free and fair democratic election. President Morsi, who is of the, at least we can say is of the Muslim Brotherhood, maybe not representing the Muslim Brotherhood in that position, became president 1 short year in office, and then there was officially a coup d'etat. The break here is that a lot of Egyptians don't like to call it a coup d'etat. They call it a popular revolution yet again. I'm a political scientist, so you know if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And in political science, when the military overthrows a democratic elected government, it's called a coup. But again, a lot of Egyptians don't like that term. They do feel that as though he saved Egypt from the brink of an Islamist government. And so the country is divided today. We've had a very tense year and a bit of Morsi, sorry, I should say President Sisi in office. He did have an election, although not free and fair. And as a result, we have a country that is very much in turmoil. Okay, so my first question, and I'll start with Eid. You know, we hear this a lot, right? I mean, you know, we keep hearing this narrative, this conversation, right, that somehow President Sisi saved Egypt, right? I mean, you know, we were going down this path of this Islamist government. You know, eventually everybody's going to be wearing a burqa. You know, everybody was going to be banned from all of the secular enjoyments that Egyptians had. I mean, there's this myth that somehow Egypt was this very secular, progressive country, and suddenly Sisi was going to come in and save the day. So what do you think, what's going on right now? Give us a sense of what's the sentiment on the ground. I mean, when people came out July 30th of I'm losing track of the years now, is it 2013? 2013, to ask for, according to many, ask for the overthrow of Morsi, Sisi was kind of put on a pedestal as being the man who could save Egypt. You and I traveled to Egypt at that time. We saw these images of Sisi painted over a lion. His face was everywhere in the capital. I mean, there was this feeling that he was this, demagogue, frankly. What's your take on what's going on the ground? What's going on in Egypt? What are you hearing from people? Is that still a dominant narrative even in those camps?
Yeah. First of all, let's start from like the very beginning when Sisi came to the scene, and people thought of him in two ways. Sisi is a strong man comparable to Morsi, so he will be able to lead the country in a better way. The second thing is that Sisi is also going to, being someone coming from the army, he will be able to achieve more progress with regard to economy, with regard to politics, Egypt's foreign policy, which has been deteriorated during the era of the Muslim Brotherhood, according to this some people believe in that the foreign policy, the economy, everything has been deteriorated during the Muslim Brotherhood. If you ask me about how people feel about it after 1 year of Sisi as the president of Egypt, I was in Egypt, 3 weeks ago. I spent only 48 hours, but I got the opportunity to meet with many people, whether people who work in academia or even laymen who just live in a countryside in Egypt. And I would say that there is still a majority in Egypt who are supporting Sisi. There is still many people who believe that this guy will be able to achieve a lot of progress. And they believe that any shortcomings, any failures actually belong to the government, not to the Sisi.
So they separate Sisi from the government.
Exactly. So whatever good things happened during this year, it belongs to Sisi alone. And
what's happened good? I mean, tell me, I'm curious to know, what is the good? Because I see the same thing you do. But what's the good? What has Sisi done that people think is so wonderful?
If we talk about bread, the problem of bread has been solved. I'm talking about the villages and the small cities where people
but you mean physically, the subsidized bread?
This has been, this has been solved. And many people don't face a problem as they used to during the Morsi's era with regard to obtaining what they require for their life from bread. And streets organizing the streets, and I'm talking about traffic and people who used it to misuse the pavement there, and cleaning the streets, and so they feel that there is some kind of organized life better than it was under the Muslim Brotherhood era. And the stories about people got arrested and imprisoned for no reason, the majority of the people I met, they believe that this is not it's for a good reason. Those people are making terrorist attacks against the government, against the people, and they should be arrested, etc. And when you try to discuss with people about the Constitution, for example, where is the Constitution in the decisions taken by Sisi? Where is the Parliament, which according to the Constitution should be there a long time ago? And they keep justifying the whole thing, like saying, you know, that Sisi would like to do it, but people, especially Muslim Brotherhood, are still constituting an obstacle on his way. So he wanted to do it, but he couldn't do it because of what is going on around. You see the terrorist attacks everywhere, people attacking police stations, and so people keep, until this moment, still the majority who supported Sisi
Right.
still find a way to justify the whole thing.
Can I ask, Dalia, I want to ask you something, and I apologize, I'm trying to make this more fluid. It's a non-academic politeness of taking, I'm just going to play the moderator like a talk show host, right? Dalia, can I ask you something? And I know this is not one of the questions that's on here, but I really hope that you can give us the political science view and with your understanding of Egyptian politics. What's the love fest with the military all about? I mean, what is this about? You know, in Egypt, we have this, we saw it in Tahrir, right? Even in Tahrir, there was, you know, the hated police, which obviously is part of the Ministry of Interior, and there's this long-standing history of hating the police for all their abuses. But there is this, and I remember, and I'm sure you do as well, this incredible weird love fest with the military that's pervading Egyptian society. I mean, you know, we've talked in our class, in our lecture of, in the Introduction to the Middle East, Egyptian military never did well, but yet always was celebrated for being heroes, but yet they failed miserably. You and I know that you go to Egypt and there are all these amazing monuments to a military that, you know, basically failed every time. What's up with that? What is the deep sociological explanation for this love fest with the military?
So in Egypt, everyone's got a family member in the military. And so the military are really the heroes of the nation because you're the sons of the nation. And it's always been a country that's needed a charismatic hero, and the hero is really formulated in the vision of the army. Yes, they haven't ever successfully gone to war defending the nation. They've really, in the past couple of years, just fired on their own people. So there is a love for the army. However, the army also controls about 40% of the economy.
Yeah.
If you want really good water, right, Siwa, the army produces water, the army produces rice, the army produces pasta. The army controls a large section of the economy. So if the army was to be done away with, it would really hurt the country economically because they bleed into all sectors of the state. But in terms of Sisi's, I just want to answer something you said, success in terms of eliminating the bread shortage, right? So yes, just last week, Egypt imported 4 tons of wheat for bread. This is unprecedented in the history of Egypt to actually import that much. And so in order to kind of fend off the rising decrease in the economy, we're seeing the state actually increase subsidies in a way that it's unsustainable.
And can I just interrupt to say to the class that Egypt imports almost all of the wheat required to produce that bread. So it's a huge foreign exchange drain on the economy with no tourism, with no real foreign exchange receipts of a steady nature. It's quite problematic for its economy.
And if we look just at the economic standing of the average Egyptian before the revolution and after the revolution. So the latest data we have says that 49.5%, so almost 50% of the country now lives on less than $1.80 a day. And it used to be around 40 to 42% before the revolution. So poverty is on the rise. But sometimes I tell my students we need to take a larger step back and stop looking at individuals. This wasn't really about Sisi. It wasn't about Morsi. It really has to do with the strategic importance of Egypt in the region. If undergrads do a Google search on strategic importance of Egypt, every article you're going to find was written in 2013. Because the consolidation of power under Morsi, had it actually gone through, was going to mean a different strategic importance of Egypt. So if we look at how Egypt developed historically in terms of its political importance to the region, the great alignment between Egypt and, or the fending off, the great alignment between Egypt and the United States, moving away from Russia, leading Syria to have to look towards Iran, was a really big deal. And it changed the region in a way where the U.S.-Egyptian alliance and ultimately Camp David under President Sadat led to a really great paradigm shift. And so there's this great question that happened in 2013 where if the Morsi regime was actually able to consolidate power, what would happen to the region? What would happen to the region, especially since we started to see signals from the regime that Syria was not going to be left alone. And so if Syria wasn't going to be left alone, and much of the opposition was going to be sympathetic to the current regime in Egypt, what would that mean for the greater region? And so sometimes I feel like we need to take a step back and understand that this is, I mean, I'm a professor of foreign policy, but this is about geopolitics in the region. It's not about simply a charismatic leader and the role of the military. Now, it becomes about the role of the military when we think about, well, if the United States has historically funded this military, a military that has not gone to war, used any of this stuff in 40 years, much of it has aged. And we started to see some kind of strategic meandering from countries like Russia and France, saying, oh, we're going to sell you arms. You don't necessarily have to rely on the United States. And so here we're starting to see a possibility of the status quo foreign policy towards Egypt could have possibly changed. And so it's not about simply looking at it through the Islamist government versus secular opposition. It's not about looking at it through the lens of Israel and strategic interests in the region, but really how would have foreign policy in the region shifted if the status quo was going to shift?
So can I push you on that? Because are you implying that there was a fear in some greater establishment, some, whether it's, I don't even know who those actors would be, but was there a fear in some established quarters that the Islamists coming to government and consolidating power and rule in Egypt would really shift frankly, the balance of power that's existed since the peace treaty in 1979? I mean, is that what you're implying, Dalia, or am I mistaken?
I'm implying that, but I'm consistently going to step away from the Islamist accusation.
Okay.
I think if Egypt was going to, for example, start to have a different foreign policy where it took what was happening in Syria seriously, if it took what was happening in Gaza seriously,
right.
If the Gulf countries started to see that a revolution fundamentally brought about change, which would destabilize their region, we need to look at it in that kind of lens. So I'm not going to play conspiracy theory and say that there was some, backhanded stuff happening, but I'm going to say that we really need to look at it in terms of how the region would have changed if the strategic alliances were going to be recalibrated.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give Wael the awkward job of trying to put this in real terms. I mean, you stood in the position of hearing, or at least being able to be a part of conversations about sort of the changes that were going on. I mean, and I'm sure you've heard a million conspiracy theories come with that. What was your, take? What would you tell us was your impression on how the world viewed the geostrategic position of Egypt under the Morsi government?
Sure. So it's a very complicated question. But I think clearly, and Dalia's spoken about Russia and France and Israel. I think that there's probably, we can look at three main actors or groups of actors. The Gulf, which was divided into two camps, one led by Qatar, or really including only Qatar, and the other one which included then Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Kuwait to a lesser extent. And very closely aligned with that troika was Israel. And we now know, we knew at the time, but we now know for sure that that group of four heavily invested in both PR, lobbying, largely in the United States, but elsewhere, to advance a particular narrative. That narrative was the danger posed by the Islamist government of Mohamed Morsi, and it was really a job that was sold on multiple levels, from social changes, Egypt will be transformed into a deeply conservative country, all the way to the geostrategic piece. So there was clearly that. There were the other sort of bystanders or observers would be the second camp, and that is largely Europe. And Europe was divided and remains divided. There is Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, Spain, who have a very difficult economic situation and are looking to Egypt, were looking to Egypt, are still looking to Egypt as a way to enlarge and expand their economy and to survive really in a very difficult economic climate. And so those countries will deal with whoever is in power. They did. You know, President Morsi's first visit to Europe was to Brussels, the European Union, and his second visit, which was really on the same trip, was to Rome. We were exceptionally well received and feted in Rome. The third group, and to some extent, France joins that group. They're economically, challenged at the moment. The sale of the Rafale jet fighter it's not coincidental that Egypt is the first buyer of the jet. For 25 years, they've tried to sell it, and they haven't been able to find a successful purchaser. The third actor really would be the United States, and the dogma in Egypt, whichever camp you're in, and clearly people are polarized, is that the United States is against Egypt's interests. So if you support the President Morsi and the democratic experiment, most of that camp firmly believes that the United States was at the heart of the coup. The supporters of Sisi and the army and the military firmly believe that Sisi is the bulwark against American intervention. So,
ironically, since they receive $1.5 billion of aid, including $1 billion military aid.
Yeah, so you're making the mistake of letting facts get in the way. Very un-Egyptian.
Yeah.
I think the United States is a very complicated situation, and I think that there are at least 4 different influence centers in United States decision making, and I think we here as Middle Easterners often ignore that complexity.
Absolutely.
And we flatten the power dynamics and the interactions. The State Department, Pentagon, the CIA, and the White House, and I'm not even talking about Congress,
Right.
but those are 4 different groups within the United States decision-making hierarchy, and on Egypt, they all happen to have slightly divergent views.
Absolutely.
In fact, to the point where I firmly believe that the State Department had a particular view, and that was different from Secretary Kerry's view on Egypt, in the sense that the State Department was very much against supporting the coup, but Secretary Kerry was for it.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, Pentagon, Defense, was very much for supporting the army, but Chuck Hagel wasn't.
Right.
And then you have the National Security Agency, National Security Council, the White House, and so on. So
That's a really important teaching moment. Can I just point,
please.
guys, we've had this conversation in our class before, right? I mean, so you've heard it from someone who saw it in real life, that when we talk about these actors like the United States, we have to remember it's not a unitary actor. It really is very much divisive. And as Wael is pointing out, every department can have a very different view, including the government appointee at the helm of that organization. So that's really key in understanding the complexity of this.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I'll go a step further and say that you may hold a particular policy position in your head, or even elaborate that in detail. But in the absence of real viable alternatives and low-cost means of achieving those alternatives, most policy makers will not strongly stand behind their policies. So you may be opposed to a coup in Egypt, but the cost of doing that is prohibitive from an international relations or even from a domestic politics point of view, and so you keep that position to yourself. And we saw that in a number of foreign affairs or external affairs ministries across Europe and to some extent the United States. So what I'm trying to say is that it's a very complex world, and the difficulty that we faced back then, and we still face, I think, as Egyptians, is that most Egyptians, because of 60 years of very of hero worship, essentially, view the world in very flat terms. The belief that Sisi could come in, or that any one person could come in and solve all of Egypt's problems, emanates from that belief that there is the big man at the top, and once the big man gives his word, then everything will be solved.
Right.
And clearly, in Egypt, as elsewhere, the problems are multiple. Power is diffuse. There are power relations. Power is wielded by individuals and groups rather than concentrated in, in the hands of one or a few. And so, failure to understand that is largely what has led us to where we are right now.
Can I push you on that, Wael? Because, I mean, we also heard that a lot of criticism of Morsi's personality, right? That he was the spare tire, was an often cited term, because he really wasn't the first choice of the Muslim Brotherhood Party. I mean, without offending your former boss, I mean, do you think if Morsi wasn't the person he was, in other words, if it was more of a strongman figure, a guy who was a little more, how shall I say, how do I do this correctly and politically correct, but had a little more gumption and was a little more charismatic. He had his buffoon moments, right? We all remember his meeting with the Australian Prime Minister. You can look up the video, and some others where he kind of was a little uncouth, let's say. Do you think he would have fared better? I mean, do you think there's any fault that could be blamed on just his personality not being the one that would have satisfied the Egyptian populace for this savior?
That's a very legitimate question. I would say that, I think the description is a little bit unfair. I would say he was unused to being constantly in the public eye.
Okay.
And I think I would challenge all of you that if you had to live in the public eye, in front of the cameras, as many hours of the day, you would be caught, picking your nose and doing other things. So I think we need to appreciate that, here was a man who was essentially not a public figure. His career trajectory at that point in time was retirement. He was looking forward to retiring, and then got dragged into the public eye at a very, very intense level. But to answer the question, I would say, well, let's look at the current situation. I mean, you have that man, right? And there's an old saying that everyone appears wise until they open their mouth, and then you understand where they are. And one of the things I submit that allowed a Sisi cult to build was that he was so silent for the first year, and allowed Adli Mansour and others to take to the airwaves. Once he actually started talking, I think people are beginning to understand. Some people are beginning to understand just how shallow, the construct is. But I come back to the issue of, if President Morsi had more gumption, etc., could things have been different? And I would say that to this day, the one thing that is repeatedly taken against him, for which he is criticized, was in fact that heavy-handed authoritative action, the Constitutional Declaration of November of 2012, for which he was pilloried around the world. So, Egyptians want to have it both ways, in many ways. They want the authoritarianism, and I think, unfortunately, sadly, there's a large segment of the Egyptian population that wants that, but they don't want it, they don't want to be told that that's what it is.
Interesting. Dalia, you study Islamist politics, and what's your take on how they did? Because this was really the first Arab experiment of an Islamist party coming to power, so to speak. I mean, and then there's also, again, a little bit of debate about that, right? I mean, Morsi was technically running as an independent, but we all know he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, what's your take on the public sentiment about an Islamist, government coming to power? Do you think there would have been any hope that he would have been welcomed, or the Islamists would have been welcomed if he was a different person? I mean, what was your take on the whole concept and public attitude about Islamists writ large being in power in Egypt?
So to do good social science, we don't rely on 1 year of data.
Right.
But if we take a longer view, and so some of my research looked at what Islamists did in parliament in the decade prior, especially in the 2005 to 2010 parliamentary session. 2005 was an interesting moment in the Middle East where there's a little bit of political opening. And during that parliamentary election, 88 members of the Muslim Brotherhood who ran as independents got elected into office. And so what I did was track their political behavior in the parliament. What committees did they sit on? What agenda did they set forth? What coalitions did they form? And most of it was bread and butter issues, right? They weren't sitting on the education committee or on the religious committee. They were sitting on economic committees, education committees. And so what ultimately I found is that they were actually working as politicians, right? Trying to improve life for the most part in their localities. And then one of the kind of greatest findings I found was that they actually shied away from religious issues simply because they were also politicized, but they were not really producing anything. And so they wanted to be seen as productive members of parliament. And because they were productive members of parliament, the entire parliament had to be productive. And so members of the NDP would say,
And that's the governing party.
That's the governing party, was that if 88 members of them are coming to parliament, at least 100 of us have to show up. And so historically in Egypt, no one went to parliamentary session because it was a rubber stamp organization. And so the entire functioning of that body over that 4 to 5 year time period was much more dynamic. And the next election cycle was 2010. Not a single one of them was reelected into parliament. That was December of 2010. And we all know what happened in January of 2011. So when we think about what happens when Islamists come to power, we have this kind of, well, the bogeyman's going to come into power and, you know, we're all going to be, schools are going to be shut, we're all going to be covered, the beaches are going to be closed. But what we saw was, you know, political behavior. One of my professors who was part of the Solidarity movement in Poland said, well, you know, revolutions happen and people get into politics, but the first thing they have to do is when they get elected into office is shave their beards, put on a suit, and get to work. And so that's really what we saw in that time period. So I'm going to kind of continue to problematize the fear of Islamists coming into power without real evidence of what the Islamization narrative actually led to. If we look at that 1 year of the Morsi administration, and I can't speak for them because he's right here, but if we really look at that 1 year time period, we need to understand what was happening in the world politically, what was happening in the world economically. A wise person once told me that we were in office, but we weren't necessarily in power.
Yeah.
What does that mean? That there were so many external and internal forces that had to negotiate this 1 year time period. If we look at, you know, I always tell my students, in politics there are winners and losers. Who was going to stand to lose the most if, under this 1 year administration, if they really were able to actually fight corruption? If they were really actually able to fight corruption, then the top business elites, which were former Mubarak era, basically crony capitalists, would have to lose. And they're a segment of the population that were going to stand and fight to the death for their economic and political interests. So I think we need to, and I'm going to keep pushing to break the narrative of fear of religion and actually look at the bread and butter political issues.
So can I push you on this? Because, and again, we're so like-minded, so I feel weird kind of asking this, but you know, also you have to admit that there were some Muslim Brotherhood representatives in the parliament in the year that Morsi was in power, and of course it's a little less than that they were ruling, that didn't do a great job. I mean, you know, there was this conversation about female circumcision and all these other issues that started to come. I mean, so, I mean, what's your take on, I mean, did they, because you say that at the time in 2005 to 2010, they focused on economic issues and social issues. But we did see a number of representatives who crossed the line and started talking about some of these, you know, taboo topics that nobody wanted to. So, and I can't recall her name, the one representative that everybody ridiculed, but, you know, there were a lot of mainstream Egyptians who saw this going on, a conversation about, you know, bringing in female circumcision again, re-legalizing it, all these other topics. I mean, did they shoot themselves in the foot in some way? I mean, you can't say that they completely focused on bread and butter issues because there were a lot of social taboo stuff that was being brought up at the time by certain representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood.
So I come from this crazy place called the United States, where we have this thing called the Tea Party. And we have members of Congress who are saying things like, we don't need abortion because products of rape will be naturally aborted. So I don't think we can say that Egyptian members of parliament are the only people in office who say crazy, insane things. But the great thing about democracy is just as they're voted into office, they can be voted right out. So I don't think we can hold them to a different standard that we don't hold people in elected office all over the world.
Agreed, completely. I mean, you remember the media. I mean, you're an observant of Egyptian media more than anybody I know. I mean, what's your take on that time period that Morsi was in power? Because as we remember, there was I mean, part of it too, let's not forget, there was this free media landscape, right? I mean, in some way, the 1 year, I mean, talk about the difficulty of being in the limelight. Here you had Egyptian television, which, as far as I can remember, was finally the most interesting period of talk shows. I mean, we had the Bassem Youssef, for example, who really, some of you may want to look up videos of him. He's sort of the Daily Show of Egypt, created this show that basically was full of satire, and he poked a lot of fun at your former boss and did a great job of it. And also these members of parliament with their, crazy ideas. So he exposed the Tea Party, kind of like what Jon Stewart does today. But that media landscape also meant that all of the dirty laundry, right? All the dirty Tea Party equivalent dirty laundry was suddenly for Egyptians to consume. I mean, what was your take about that year in terms of how people saw the Islamists running things?
Before answering
And speaking
your
to the
question,
mic,
I just have some comments on what Dalia and Wael said. I don't believe that the international or regional factors or actors or the charismatic character of Morsi is the main issue with regard to what happened in Egypt after the revolution. Let's take it back to 2011 when the revolution happened. And I would say that Plan B was there by the army just before the Mawqat al-Jamal, or how would you translate?
The day of the camel.
Yeah. Just before this incident, Plan B by the army was there. And the army, don't forget that the army was the only actor in the scene at that time, the only one that was in touch with the Pentagon, the Department of State, Saudi Arabia. Any regional or international actor was in touch with the army at that time. And in 2011, I visited Egypt to do some research on the Arab Spring. I got the opportunity to meet 4 people from the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. One of them was Sisi. And 3 of them actually were against the January 25th revolution, and they announced it in public, and they said that this was actually intended to take Egypt backward, and it's against the will of the people, but it has been concocted by some foreign powers, blah, blah, blah. The only one who was supporting the January 25th revolution in his conversation with me was the Sisi. He the only one who said Mubarak actually was dead and was not in the scene at all 10 years ago. And it's Gamal and Ahmed Aez and other figures from the National Democratic Party in Egypt was leading the scene 10 years. And we already warned him against this revolution, but he didn't listen to us. So I think that whether we have Mohamed Morsi, whether we have Bassem Youssef, whether we have anyone else from outside the military, anyone even with charisma, he will not be able to get like things as intended to be. Like it has been already planned that the Muslim Brotherhood will be out of the scene after 1 year. I've heard that.
Can I push back on that a little bit?
I just continue my point, and then you can make your comment. Like 6 months before Morsi was ousted, I heard from some businessmen from Egypt that it's June. This is the end of the Muslim Brotherhood era. Many of the Muslim Brotherhood leaders or members I know, they told me that the army will not be able to do it, like to do a coup against Morsi, because actually we have very good relations. This was like a few days before July 3rd. So I think this has been planned, and the whole scene was controlled by the army. And I don't think that there is any kind of control by the Muslim Brotherhood over things. But the army was intending to have the people back to support the army. The scene was not ready in 2011 for Ahmed Shafiq, for example. It was very easy to have Ahmed Shafiq, who belongs to the army, succeed in the election with Morsi, because the difference was actually a little bit, like we are talking about a few thousands. So it was easy to have Ahmed Shafiq as a president, who is someone coming from the army, who has support of 50% of the population. But this was not the case. Let's have someone there to like bear the burden of the 30 years of Mubarak, and then we just get rid of this party. And this is the plan right now, to get rid of Islamists. I don't believe that there is any kind of communication between the army and the Muslim Brotherhood to fix things and to have some kind of communication. I don't believe in that. We have heard a lot about that in the media, but this is not true.
Can I recap?
Because,
sorry.
Yeah, sorry, go
No,
ahead.
I just want to recap this and then get Wael to point this out for the class. And again, this is teachable moments, because I'm trying to put this into context of where my class is in their evolution of understanding Middle East politics. There is this pervasive argument, Aid is representing this idea that really there is always the deep state at work, that really the military, which, as Dalia pointed out earlier, has deep vested interest economically in Egypt today, 40% of the economy, although there's numbers of 20%. We don't know, it's not even public, to understand how much of the economy is controlled by the army. So what Aid is arguing is that really the deep state was at work. In other words, the military had this plan at the whole time, that to give power over to the Muslim Brotherhood, to the Islamists, because they knew they would fail. It was so hard to manage. Egypt was in a position of 30 years of disarray. And one evidence of that, and I think that this is an interesting point, is that there was at one point an election between Morsi and Shafiq. Shafiq was the, let's call him the regime man. He was really representing what was the mainstream military viewpoint. Was he officially a member of the NDP? Previously? Yeah? Okay. So he was part of the ruling party. I mean, he was in the cabinet of Mubarak, but he was part of the ruling party that was in power under Mubarak. So, and it came down to basically a hair. I mean, it must have been 51 to 49%, I can't remember, but something very close, that Morsi won by 51%. And the argument is that the military really wanted Morsi to take power, ironically, because they wanted him to fail and therefore end the Islamist project, the idea that Islamists could win through the ballot box. And so this was all preordained. Wael, you got to jump in on that.
What Aid is saying actually isn't that let them govern, they will fail. It was let them govern, we will make them fail. And that was really the military's plan to regain power after Mubarak era. And I think I actually wholeheartedly agree, and I don't think it's an argument anymore. It's pretty much fact. David Kirkpatrick and I believe Patrick Kingsley from the New York Times and The Guardian, respectively, reported on this, that Sisi, in fact, had elaborated a plan in anticipation of the fall of the Mubarak regime because he felt that it had become too unstable, and described a way for the military to regain power in the aftermath of that pretty much played out in 2012, 2013. My only pushback is to say that events are not predetermined. There is not a, that was the Army's plan B for sure, 100%, but it did not have to necessarily evolve that way. And in particular, and this is, I'm biased obviously because I'm having some of those conversations, but our conversations with the international community were, again, both sides of the Atlantic, that there is such a thing as taking a stand, and that any kind of prevarication or equivocation around the army's illegal seizure of power will be translated by the army as a green light to do more. We said that before the Republican Guard massacre on the 9th of July. We said that again before the massacre at Rabaa. We said that again before October 6th. And events have unfolded very much as we had predicted, that the silence, relative silence, the tepid statements of objection by the international community are being interpreted by the army as a go-ahead, green light, we're in support. That may not be how they're intended, and different governments are making difficult calculations, but that is the effect. So was that the plan by the army? Absolutely, 100%. Did it have to unfold that way? Absolutely not. I think this could have been prevented.
I think, Bessma, when you refer to the deep state, most people believe that this is the Mubarak state. But actually, what I believe in is that there was like an intention to create a new state, different than the deep state, the traditional one, the Mubarak one.
Okay.
Because the July 1952 state, in the eyes of those young officers like Sisi, became too old. So it's time to have the July 2013 new state, which has even the Nukhba or the elite, the group of the elite group that Sisi has right now around him are totally different than the other groups. He's trying to create a new state different than that one because that one is too old. One of the main reasons for postponing the parliament elections is actually his fear of the Mubarak state to come back. Because most of the businessmen are like making connections with people in different areas in Egypt in order to get the National Democratic Party maybe under different names, but getting it back. But one of the main reasons, it's not the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not like some people saying, oh, the popularity of Muslim. No, it's not that. He's against the return of the Mubarak state. He is creating a new state along with some young officers in the army who thought that July 1952 state is too old.
So there is this narrative then that actually the military establishment, that the 40% of the economy was being challenged by this private sector that Mubarak and particularly his son was really, germinating and supporting. And so this was a way to bring back actually Egypt to that statist model that I've talked about in our class, back to that Nasserist model of having the army back in power. So that's an interesting, so there's a third part of this. It's not just about Islamist versus so-called secularist. Within the so-called secularist camp, we have to recognize that there's the military today, which sees its vested interest being threatened by the sort of neoliberal, capitalist, crony capitalist elite that were getting very powerful under Mubarak. And we even saw, and that's interesting because that suggests that the military also allowed the revolution overthrow of Mubarak, right? I mean, there was, Dalia, you're shaking your head. I mean, what's your take also on that? I mean, that kind of view of how Egypt is segmented.
Well, Mubarak had become a liability.
Interesting.
And so to do away with him was in the best interest of the military and ultimately of the state. But if we look at what happened about 2 weeks ago when Mubarak's son, Gamal, was convicted, and given that sentence, which he doesn't have to serve because of time served. So if you're a convicted criminal, you can't run for office. And so here's this little signaling game that happened that, well, you're out, you can go about your business, but your time in politics is over. And so which feeds into a little bit of what Aid was just saying.
So can you explain the witch hunt now of Islamists, though? I mean, if the army didn't want the Mubarak cronies to succeed, they've gone really far in also demonizing the Islamists. I mean, what's up with that? I mean, what's their objective in wanting to make this whole segment that at least at minimum, can we say, is about 10% of popular support is still sort of die-hard Muslim Brotherhood party members, right? Maybe some would say 15, but I think it's about 10, right? You can't, I mean, that's what, 9 million people. You can't completely eliminate 9 million people. Why is this demonization of the Islamists so now pervasive if really the target is about preventing or changing power from the Mubarak era cronies to this military state model?
Because it's about eliminating all opposition. If we think about it historically, like, look, we need to learn from history here. We can look at the examples of Latin America. No military coup that removed a democratically elected leader has led to anything but authoritarian rule. But coups that have removed authoritarian rule have allowed for pathways to democracy. And so we're seeing the same pattern happen here. And so in order for this regime to continue, it needs to eliminate the opposition from all segments of society, which is what they're doing. There's 40%, 40,000, 41,000 political prisoners now. Just yesterday, 250 more NGOs were shut down for having deals with the Muslim Brotherhood, or historic ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. These NGOs are the ones who actually do most of the social welfare exercise that the state doesn't perform for the population. So what you're getting is a moment in history where the economy is not doing as well, the social welfare institutions that are run independently are being restricted, and much of the opposition that historically has been Islamist in nature has been eliminated. And so in order for this regime to continue to consolidate power, this model needs to continue. The question is this a sustainable model? And we also know from history this can't go beyond another decade.
Wael.
So if I can just maybe throw some flesh on that, and so that you, and so I'll address myself to your students, so that you understand how, as Churchill said, the sausage is made. When Sisi came to office, or to power, really, in 2013, so immediately after the coup, there were a number of advisors around him, 3 to be specific, and I've had conversations with some of those people. And they were trying to convince him of the need to build a political system. The idea that even if he governs as an authoritarian leader, he cannot do so directly. It's the expression in Arabic is lahir siyasi. He has a type of political, backing of some sort. And it was pointed out that each of the previous military rulers of Egypt, whether it was Sadat or Abdel Nasser or Mubarak, had done that. Whether it was Al-Ittihad al-Ishtiraki or the National Democratic Party or whatever form of political manipulation they had done in order to give the appearance that the country is being ruled not by decree, not by one-man rule, but through some kind of participatory political system. And each of those 3 advisors firmly believed that he had, Sisi's ear, and that the suggestion that is being put forward is going to be the one that is going to be adopted. And in fact, he adopted none of those suggestions. And it's unclear why, whether he doesn't understand this idea that you need a political system to interface with the people, or whether there's pushback from the military that is still too scared of the Mubarak example. Mubarak was an army man, but he eventually walked away from the army in favor of his children. So unclear, but the reality is, as Dalia and Aid have mentioned, he doesn't have that now, and the answer to the question, is it sustainable, it's not. No one believes it is. And so there is now mounting opposition even from within the coalition of political parties that initially supported June 30th, because they feel that they are about to be completely left out in the cold, number one. And number two, which is more disturbing, is they don't understand how this regime proposes to run the country. Before I close, I want to read you a little paragraph from the Globe and Mail yesterday. And it's about elections, presidential elections, in Poland. And it says, official results released Monday afternoon showed that the challenger, Andrzej Duda, had won a convincing victory over the 62-year-old incumbent, Bronislaw Komorowski, at 51.5% to 48.5%, which was the margin that President Morsi actually got. It was 1.3 million people. It was the margin of the vote. But forever and ever and ever, we keep talking about what a razor-thin margin that was. In every other election around the world, 1.3 million votes is actually a substantial substantial, sizable, convincing difference.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to throw this back to you, Wael, because you know, one of the things that we see today is this common narrative that the Muslim Brotherhood has gone rogue, right? And in the popular Egyptian media particularly, there is this conflation with the Muslim Brotherhood and now ISIS wannabes that have taken over Sinai. What's your take? If you can reflect on that media representation, I'm sure you're going to say misrepresentation, but reflect on it in terms of what you hear, and I'll get the panelists as well to tell me what they're hearing and reading in Egyptian papers. How is that really believed by the people? Do people really buy this argument that Sisi's presented that, well, if he's not presented it, he's at least inferring it, that the Muslim Brotherhood, elements of it have gone rogue and have gone now with ISIS and are trying to create a caliphate, and basically conflating all of the baggage that the West has with ISIS, obviously, into the Egyptian narrative. What's your take on things? Is there, and can you be blunt, can I ask you very bluntly, is there a rogue element? I mean, not to say that ISIS, I mean, you know, but is there an element of the Muslim Brotherhood that's basically said, you know, the hell with the idea of trying the democratic process, because we tried that and there was a coup. So now we need to do something else. And what's that else?
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, you know, the relation between ISIS and the Brotherhood is very clear. ISIS believes that President Morsi is an apostate, that he was the single greatest harm to Islam in the 21st century. Because he offered an alternative that was, you know, according to them, cloaked or garbed in Islamic garb. And so their view on Morsi specifically in the Brotherhood is extreme disapproval. As you mentioned, there is significant support for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in the millions. The core membership of the Brotherhood in Egypt is estimated to be somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million. That's the very, very kind of sort of core membership. And so on the one hand, if that organization or significant elements within it had decided to turn to violence, we would be seeing a significantly different landscape in Egypt today. By all accounts, this is a very tightly knit, very organized, very disciplined group of individuals, and even if 2,000 or 3,000 people, which is a fraction of 1% of the membership, were to turn to violence in a concerted way, you wouldn't recognize the country anymore. So I think the facts speak for themselves. Despite, if you exclude the Sinai, the country is largely a stable country. People go about their business in a fairly normal way. It is not, despite what the media keeps hearkening to, this is not Iraq, this is not Syria, it's not Yemen, it's not Libya. There's a significant amount of stability. Having said that, the fact that we continue to deny credit to the Muslim Brotherhood for mounting what is effectively the longest-running, effective, peaceful protest movement in the face of severe repression and authoritarianism may very well lead people to conclude that this is useless. If I can't get what I want and I'm not recognized for what I'm doing, why continue doing it? So it's a fine calculus. I don't know. I can't, as Yogi Berra said, you can't make, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. I don't know how things will turn out. I'm personally not very hopeful. I think the situation will continue to deteriorate. I think we will see more violence, but I think we will see the violence in spite of the Muslim Brotherhood's attempts to contain it rather than because they're pursuing it.
Dalia, what's your take on sort of the Islamist political movement? I mean, do you think they're going to fracture from within and say, basically the tradition of the Muslim Brotherhood vying for political power through the ballot box is now dead? I mean, do you sense that there is going to be a fracturing from within, leading some to join more radical organizations?
So I was teaching a Mideast politics course during the revolution, and we were all captivated at that time. I know for undergrads who are 18, I know 14 is such a long time ago, but It was an awesome moment, and I remember telling my students, it was towards the end of the semester, and we were talking, the class on terrorism, and so I remember saying, it's almost as if we're watching the death of terrorist ideology, or the bankruptcy of it, because change happened so peacefully and so dramatically that nothing like Al-Qaeda or bin Laden could bring about this kind of change. And so we might be witnessing the end of radical terrorist ideology. But if we go back to what happened during Nasser's era, Egyptian Islamic Jihad and what's the other one? Jamaat Islamiyya were born out of this real repression. And so when we think about when we talk about strategic interests of the region and the war on terror, where do we get radicalism from? And had this democratic moment continued to blossom, we would have seen the continued bankruptcy of terrorist ideology. If we look at what the Muslim Brotherhood has said historically since the 1970s, constantly condemning violence, insisting on nonviolence, silmiya, they've remained committed to that. Historically, we have studied the internal and external debates of the Brotherhood. We cannot do that today because much of the Brotherhood hierarchy is either in prison, facing death sentences, already been convicted and sentenced, not yet carried out, or are in exile. So the great debates that we want to see happening in the Brotherhood, we can't see because they can't happen outside. And so it's just a long way of saying we've seen commitment to nonviolence. But what happens to a young population where the numbers are over 50% of the population are between the age of, I think, 18 and 30. The economy is tanking. There are no job opportunities. The democratic experiment in the eyes of many young people failed. They went to the polls 5 times only to see what they voted for curtailed. And so that could be what leads to a rise in violence, that moment of frustration. And I think, again, we have to move away from it's a byproduct of the Muslim Brotherhood. No, the Muslim Brotherhood historically has been keeping this kind of narrative at bay by insisting on engaging in social welfare and social justice programs.
But you and I know that the media squarely blames the Egyptian media today, where there's a lot of censorship and obviously a great deal. I mean, today, the recent laws that have come out, even making it illegal to some social media being now targeted as well along these censorship laws. But the media is in Egypt today in a hyper-nationalist moment where they are conflating the Muslim Brotherhood with all radical activity. And Wael pointed out that outside of Sinai, things are stable, but I'd push you on that because for a lot of Egyptians, seeing military and police installations inside Cairo, telecommunication towers being bombed in 6th of October City, these were all blamed squarely at the feet of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So what's your take on this? I mean, can you reflect on the media's, why the media is doing this? Do you have thoughts on sort of whether people are buying it in terms of the average Egyptian? I mean, do they really think that, yes, it is the Muslim Brotherhood that are, killing police and bombing telecommunication towers?
So the first incidents of terrorist activity were committed by Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis. So the Muslim Brotherhood was declared a terrorist organization long before Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis was considered a terrorist organization. They were committing terrorist act, and they were not considered a terrorist organization. So it's very instrumental for the regime to continue to displace blame on an organization because it is real opposition. And for us to be listening to the news and say Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis has shot down a chopper in Sinai, but they're not considered a terrorist organization is probably quite telling. I think I'll stop there.
Okay. What's your take on especially the average Egyptian?
It's also connected to some announcements by some Muslim Brotherhood leaders. Don't forget what al-Biltagi, one of the leaders of Muslim Brotherhood in Rab'a, said that if you stop the terrorism will stop in Sinai. This means that you are in control of what's happening in Sinai. So it is related to some of their announcements. Some groups of Muslim Brotherhood young people on Facebook, putting information about officers in the police on the Facebook, saying that we have to kill this officer because he is one of those who are torturing our members in the prison. So it is related to the whole situation inside the country. Some announcements were irresponsible, like this one by Beltagi. After that, he said that I didn't mean that we are in control. But the Egyptian media is using these announcements to feed the idea that Muslim Brotherhood is connected to those Islamic groups, Islamists in Sinai.
I mean, do you think that if the rank, or I should say, if the hierarchy, if the people in charge were able to be in the country, that they were able to have a better control on the rank and file? I mean, is part of this the lack of real command and control of the party? I mean, does the party lost control of its foot soldiers, so to speak, and now they are going rogue, maybe because there is nobody keeping them in line like they had been in line for 30 years? I'm looking at you, Dalia, sorry.
So I'm not sure that these acts are being committed in the name of the Muslim Brotherhood by elements of the Muslim Brotherhood who consider themselves members of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
You can do anything in the name of anything.
Sure.
In terms of the hierarchy, I know there's a lot of debate out there about where is it and where does it exist, and is there a real hierarchy now, and where do orders come from? And it's something I don't know. It's something I don't have information on.
If only we knew someone who might be able to tell us something about that.
So actually, I don't know, to put that question to rest. I suspect that given that it's been 2 years now, that a very hierarchical organization like the Muslim Brotherhood in a very hierarchical society like Egypt would have replaced its entire hierarchy by now. 2 years is far, far too long to survive on the hope that this is now a temporary thing. So I don't know, but I suspect that that all of those individuals whose names we know are essentially irrelevant to the equation.
So you think it's in disarray? I mean, is that what you're saying? That
No. I mean, I think somebody had made just a very kind of back of the envelope calculation, saying that there's a great sense of social solidarity within the Brotherhood, but in Egypt in general. And so if you look at roughly the anywhere between 20 and 40,000 people who are in prison, at a minimum 1,200, probably closer to 3,000 or 4,000 people that have died. There is this tradition of supporting the families of the prisoners and the people that died. And if you make a quick calculation, you're looking at somewhere between 100 to 150 million pounds a month. And every indication is that there is a sense of that support happening. You can't do that without a fairly complex and effective kind of organization. So my sense is the organization is there. Now, I haven't been to Egypt in 2 years, so this is all observations from afar. But I think, again, to kind of paraphrase Mark Twain, reports of the organization's demise are exaggerated.
Interesting. So here's the hard question. Where do you think Egypt's going to be in 5 years? I mean, does anybody foresee a return to a democratic election in 5 years? I think we're all pessimistic on that, aren't we?
5 years is a long time. I think that the easier question to ask is, where is Egypt going to be in a year? Okay. And the answer to that is either in a fundamentally better place or in entirely the opposite place. The status quo, I think, is impossible. I think the chances of Egypt being in a better place in a year are slim. So I think we're looking at worse. I love my quotes. Abba Eban, who I should not be quoting, apparently once said that men and governments behave reasonably once they have exhausted all other options. So there is a hope, perverse hope, that as we go to the brink, that both sides will come to understand that they need to coexist rather than to continue to take out each other.
But I mean, what's interesting today is that I think not only is the country very divided, but I think there is a real economic crisis that Egypt is facing. I mean, as a political economist, I can't help but see this. Tourism at one point was 25% of the economy. Tourists are not coming. They're not going to come as long as that's the case. There's no capital in the country. As much of even the neoliberal elite, right? At one point, they were the engine of economic growth, quote unquote. You can argue that it was distributed equitably, so forth, but they're not interested in investing. They're very scared still, although Sisi is trying to reassure them. And at the same time, foreign investment is not rushing to Egypt, despite all the so-called conferences that Sisi's putting on. We keep hearing about Gulf donors giving big sums, 4 billion, 4 billion. That seems to be the favorite number. But we also saw very recently in the New York Times and other places release of damning tapes against Sisi where he is actually making fun of the Gulf states for continuing to just basically bankroll Egypt. I think that's starting to hit. And also you have to remember that the Gulf states themselves are increasingly less interested in bankrolling Egypt, right? I mean, they have interests in Yemen and they have interests locally. So that's become an increasingly important concern. And Syria, of course. Ambassador and the Consulate General, please have a seat here. Your seats are waiting for you. Welcome. So reflections on that, please. Aid, Dalia, what's your take on Egypt's future?
I think if you are talking about 1 year, it's the battle right now between the Mubarak camp and the new camp by Sisi. So during this 1 year, it will be decided which camp will be the winner. And in both cases, it's not what we wish for Egypt, and it's not good for Egypt in both cases. But I think Sisi himself has become a burden for the army, for the if we are talking about the regional powers. There is a huge change right now in the Saudi situation, even Emirates, which is a very good support. Like 2 days ago, I read a news story about, in an Egyptian newspaper, about Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey supporting Shafiq and Anan in order to get rid of Sisi. And this is like...
Interesting.
Yeah, it's first time to have the name of Emirates with Turkey and Saudi Arabia in the same time, and like accusing it of conducting some plots against the Sisi.
So you see there's a frustration now in the Gulf with Sisi.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting.
So if we look at the initial cause of the revolution, it was really about reform, social justice, and about the poor. And we don't talk about the poor anymore. And so if we really look at I have a much more pessimistic view, only because the poor are increasing in numbers. The amount of state-perpetuated sexual violence against women and children is on the rise. The number of political prisoners is on the rise. The trust in the rule of law is on the decline. The judiciary is so highly politicized that the average Egyptian doesn't really see that this is the institution that I'm going to go to get justice. And so if you look at every indicator that's on the decline, real positive change is not going to happen for quite some time. And so I hate to be a bit more pessimistic, but I'm going to take it back to the poor. When their conditions continue to deteriorate, we're entering into a darker time period. Now, the difference is that we say the revolution broke the fear nexus. Right? People were no longer afraid of the regime. The consequence of that is, in order for the state to repress that lack of fear, was to increase the violence. And again, if we go back to history, we were taught, if you read the readings of one of Nasser's security officers. He said, what you need to do is raise the transaction costs so high that the average person is so fearful of the consequence of their action because they can't predict it. So if I enter into a protest and I say, well, okay, I might get rounded up and I'll take a ride in a police car, that's a calculation I can make. But if the calculation can't be made because my mother or my sister might be picked up, put in a prison cell, and raped, I'm going to be afraid of any behavior or committing any behavior that might be perceived as not in the name of the state. So if we go back to the initial cause of the revolution and how far they are today, I'm sorry, I'm a bit more pessimistic, and I say it's going to be a very long time before we even go back to the status quo we were pre-revolution to get beyond that to the initial cause of the revolution.
And yet, ironically, I mean, one of the rallying calls for the first revolution in Egypt in 2011 was police abuse, right? I mean, the We Are Khaled campaign. And so this doesn't go on, you know, it has costs, right? I mean, so in some way, the fact that the police has become even more brutal, I mean, this is a level of brutality that, frankly, we hadn't seen in Egypt for its history, right? I mean, it got bad under Mubarak at the very end, and now we've entered a phase where it's just disgusting. So can't we say that that actually is a powder keg, I mean, in terms of another revolutionary spirit?
Well, if we look at the example of this one activist, her name is Mahinur al-Masri, and I know we haven't talked about the nature of activism in Egypt. It's not Islamist versus the state. It's Islamist, socialist, liberal, leftist. Everyone's been picked up by the regime today.
Absolutely.
And so this one young woman, her name is Mahinur al-Masri, was sentenced to prison for 2 years because she was protesting outside of a court where the officer that was accused of killing Khaled Said was being tried, and he got acquitted. And
Right.
she would go to the courthouse and protest him, and she got 2 years in prison. She was released, but just 2 weeks ago, she was thrown back into prison. And so if we look at the symbolic politics of police brutality, and this one girl who consistently was protesting outside of, and protesting is standing outside the courthouse, right, of this one officer. And so, you know, to bring it back full circle, she's back in prison, and we no longer hear about the police trials.
Yeah, absolutely. Aid, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think what Dalia is talking about is very important, but this will not happen. We will not expect any revolution since what is going on right now actually has popularity. People are supporting it. Like, visit Egypt and you will see people saying about everything you are seeing disgusting is acceptable for them.
Yeah.
They like
Yeah.
it. They are protecting us against those enemy. One of the most troubling issues that happened since July 2013 is the change in the creed of the army itself. Now we are fighting terrorism. Forget about Israel. So terrorists can be people from Egypt. Like I remember in 2011 when people started talking about we might face this kind of encounter between the army and the people, and everyone was denying it because the army will not shoot people.
Right.
This is not in its creed. Now it is in the creed. You can find a demonstration where we accuse it as being a demonstration by Muslim Brotherhood or Islamists or whoever is in opposition to the army, and then we have to shoot them because they are terrorists. So this is the most troubling issue that happened since July 2013.
I have to agree that that's one thing that has really, I think, changed. I visited Egypt once a year in the past 15 years. And increasingly, this sort of hatred, absolute hatred toward elements of the Muslim Brotherhood are so pronounced in some parts of the country and certain parts of society. And this justification for this heavy-handedness is something I never expected to see. It's absolutely, it's toxic, right? Which is really quite scary to see this justification of military and police brutality against what I find interesting is that it's, and you say it's 1% that's hardcore members, but we're looking at 10% of support of society. Right. That's an enormous, 90 versus 10%. Right. That's the brewings of a civil war. It's not healthy.
Right. Because it would also be wrong to assume that the other 90% are a cohesive group. Again, if you just do a simple estimate, the population of Egypt has increased by 3.4 million people since the coup. That means, roughly 3 million people that have entered into some kind of adolescence, adulthood, consciousness, political awareness since the coup. Young people are far less susceptible to the effects of state media. One of my colleagues who was responsible for social media at the presidency used to say, you people, meaning gray-haired individuals like myself, are out of touch. There's an entire generation of people that cannot comprehend more than 140 characters at a time.
Except these guys.
Yeah, one would hope, given that we've been talking for an hour. There's an entire, literally a generation, millions, and every year it goes up by another million. Actually, every 8 months it goes up by another million. And so time is not on the side of brutality. It's not on the side of repression. It's not on the side of authoritarianism. Whoever governs Egypt effectively must do so by finding a way that speaks to the people rather than bludgeons them, and the people meaning all people. The notion that we can somehow build a country based on a selective understanding of who's Egyptian and who's not is not an idea that can be sustained.
Okay, I'm going to just take 2 questions from the audience. I'm going to reserve one for my colleague Mark Sedra, who I really wanted up on the panel. And then we'll take another question. I'm going to get a microphone, and then we'll turn it to the panel, but we'll stay on time, hopefully. Mark.
It's okay, I speak loud. That's really. Oh, really? I don't know if I want to. Yeah. Shall I start or?
There you go.
Well, thank you very much for the presentations. I think they were very interesting. Let me be devil's advocate then. If I could ask Dr. Haddara about, clearly a significant proportion of the Egyptian population felt disaffected from the Morsi regime. So I was wondering if you could go back with the benefit of hindsight. What would you have done differently? Because I don't think it is a matter simply of external intervention. We saw a shift. I saw it among my own family members, many of whom were very supportive of President Morsi, who shifted, who changed. There were a number of missteps, I think, miscalculations, but I was wondering if you could go back and the other panelists as well. Where do you think those mistakes were made?
So I think there's 2 pieces here. One is that, first of all, I wholeheartedly, entirely agree. I disagree about the extent, and you can trace the numbers in the Basira, Egyptian public opinion poll. This is an independent, actually Mubarak era organization. No reason to play favorites with the president. The president's approval rating in August of 2012 was 80% in October, dipped to about 57% in November after the constitutional declaration, but then rose again in January after the constitutional approval to about 62% and continued in that range until about April or May of 2013, shortly before the coup. The lowest number, which was confirmed by our own internal polling in the presidency, was an approval rating of 38%. An approval rating of 38% for a democratically elected president who was initially elected with 51% of the vote is not that bad. And it really, again, begs the question of whether that's such an unmitigated disaster that forcible removal by the military was necessary. So clearly there was a job that was played on people to make several linkages, that disaffection is very high, therefore disaffection merits removal, and that removal will lead to a better result. And I think that's, that line of thinking is clearly flawed. Does that mean that there were no mistakes? My standard line to people is that for every mistake you will cite, I have 3, mine are better, and and I saw them up front. So absolutely, there were mistakes. But I'll give you 2 pieces of information that might help contextualize this. When we walked into the presidency on June 30th, 2012, there was hardly anyone. And we discovered, and Sisi wasn't lying, that there had not been a presidency of the Arab Republic of Egypt in a meaningful sense since 2005. Since 2005, Mubarak would set foot in the presidential palace maybe once a week, and really only if he had to. Otherwise, he was home or he was at his resort in Sharm el-Sheikh. And so there was no, our conception during the election campaign was that we are going to come into an infrastructure and we will clean it up and manage it, and so it will be more clean and effective. And what we found, to paraphrase John Kennedy, is that things really were as bad as we've been saying all along. There was nothing. There was a Wi-Fi in Al-Ittihadiyya, in the presidential palace. It was open to the world. If you were sitting in a cafe across the street, you could actually hack into the Wi-Fi network. Now, that was inconsequential because nobody in that place actually operated a connected computer. So, it was irrelevant. But it's just a measure of what we were dealing with. It took us a good 6-7 months to actually begin to rebuild some kind of a bureaucracy around the president. And that is all the way from things like decision support to communications to public relations, etc. So the challenge that we were facing was really monumental. I think we did extremely well for the fact that few of us are career politicians or career administrators, and that we were dealing with a ravaged, non-existent system. Does that matter to people? Is that do people care that was such a hard job? Of course they don't. At the end of the day, they care that there was a result. If you judge the president by the results, and I published a paper immediately after the coup that actually gave numbers to some of the claims that people were making about the economy, about growth, etc. Our numbers were not bad, not spectacular, but actually considerably better than what we have seen over the last 2 years. So the facts of it do not support the real disaffection that we saw unfold in Egypt. But that's the reality. 25% of Americans believe that climate change is a myth. Another 25% of Americans believe that Obama was not born in the United States. There is a merit to not polling people on facts. But the reality is that when it comes to democratic systems, what matters is how people feel. And it's hard.
Okay, I'm sorry we're running out of time, but I want to give Dalia and Aid. Do you guys want to jump in, have final thoughts on this question?
I just wish everyone would stop picking on the Americans. But but I remember, during the first year thinking, gosh, these guys really need to hire a PR firm. They need a great speechwriter. But we're really nitpicking here, right? We're looking for faults. We're also not looking at the bigger picture. And what does it mean to talk about a society that has had no real involvement in any democratic process, that there wasn't real institutions of being involved, when you had 2 generations, I mean, not just my generation, my father's generation, who had never understood what it meant to be a political actor, what civic engagement means. And so the political learning, not just within the institutions, but within society, hadn't yet developed. Jack Snyder over at Columbia University says that the transition from authoritarian rule to democracy is extremely unstable. And it's so unstable, you want to go back to authoritarianism for the most part. And for some reason, that instability moment, which most of the former Soviet Union went through and through now in America, is an experiment we don't want the Middle East to go through. That if on day 2 the streets are not continually being cleaned, well, this democratic experiment is a failure. And so I think we need to take a longer view of history and not isolate places like Egypt from the rest of the lessons we've learned.
Thank you. We have run out of time. I want to thank our panelists very much. Again, a lot of like-minded views in this big scheme of things. There is a I think another element of the Egyptian political spectrum that I would say would probably have a lot of different views as well. So I encourage you in the era of transparency to also look at other perspectives. But I couldn't ask for a better panelists of individuals here to give us something. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, this is a very interesting question, and the Muslim Brotherhood, they do have popularity before the 2011 revolution. They were doing a lot of social work, helping people with their clinics, affordable schools, etc. And this shift is really interesting. I think media played a very vital role in this, and they were using two typos for Egyptians, which is religion and national security. And Muslim Brotherhood were accused of misusing religion to serve their political ends. This is one issue. The other thing is threatening the national security by selling lands, Sinai to Palestinians, or Halab and Shalatin to the Sudan. And I think some announcements by Morsi or Minister of Foreign Affairs in Sudan in this regard were used by the media. So these two typos were used, and this was the main reason to make this shift from supporting the Muslim Brotherhood to hating and thinking that they don't belong to Egypt anymore.
Please join me in thanking the panelists.